What's going on, everybody? Noah from Stage 3 Motorsports here, and today I'm going to be walking you through a full build overview on this 2019 F150 STX. Now, if you're a subscriber or a regular viewer of our YouTube channel, then you've probably seen this truck pop up in a couple different videos here and there over the last couple of years as we've thrown some parts on it and built it out, but it really hasn't gotten much of the spotlight. It's just been in for a couple different installs as we've done suspension and lighting and whatever else. So we wanted to take this time to really focus in and kind of showcase it as a complete build and really walk through what we did to improve the off-road capability and the look of this truck. So diving into that, as I mentioned, it is a 2019 STX and it's a super crew cab with the short bed. So it's a pretty familiar F150. I think a lot of folks have trucks that were optioned out similarly to this one from factory. So hopefully this gives you a good idea of some parts and a direction that you could go with your own build. To kick things off, I do want to start by focusing in on suspension, wheels, and tires because I think that's probably where the biggest change happened. And for suspension, this truck got a set of King 2.5 front coilovers and matching 2.5 rear shocks. Now, obviously, if you know the King name and you recognize that iconic blue color, then you're pretty familiar with King's off-road capability. But to focus in on the front coilovers first, this is a 2.5, which is referring to the actual diameter of the shock body within that coilover. And that larger shock body basically allows for a larger piston and more oil capacity within the shock. And then it also has anodized blue billet aluminum mounts top and bottom. So it's got a lot of strength and rigidity, and everything is corrosion resistant and specially coated, and it can take the abuse of running through the desert, getting hit with sand, rocks, mud, snow, whatever you have to put it through. On top of that, it obviously has external reservoirs on both sides, and the huge benefit here is that those resis allow the oil somewhere to move. And the reason that that's important is within that shock body, if you don't have a reservoir, the oil can only get compressed so far by the piston before it stops and there's just nowhere else for it to go. And so you actually limit the travel within it. But if you can push all that oil into an external reservoir, now you've allowed yourself more travel within that body and the oil has somewhere to move. So obviously that translates to better performing shock. There's also the ability to reduce fade, and that oil's not going to heat up quite as quickly. And then with the ability to extend the travel, King says that it's about a 25% increase here in travel on the vehicle. So the larger bumps are a little bit less of an issue, and you get a lot better articulation within the front end. Now, the other important feature of these coilovers is also that they increase ride height in the front end and provide a little bit of lift. With this truck, we have them set the same way they were set out of the box, which is actually pretty close to 2.5 inches of lift, and that provides a really nice level stance all the way around and quite a bit more space to tuck a bigger tire in here. Now, they can be adjusted downwards because they really range anywhere from stock ride height to 2.5, and that top collar is adjustable. So as you adjust it and put different amounts of pressure on the spring, it raises or lowers the vehicle. Now, as I said, the way it came out of the box was fine here, and it works well for the setup that we have. At the rear of the truck, we've got a matching set of King 2.5 rear shocks, and these don't actually provide any additional lift, so it's really the front end that's changing the ride height for the most part, but this isn't uncommon. Typically, any aftermarket shock you run isn't going to increase ride height in the rear. They just typically allow for a bit more travel, so if you add some ride height with a larger rear block or an add-a-leaf kit, then it won't max out the shock and it can still maintain some capability off-road. With that being said, these rear shocks do benefit from a lot of the same attributes that the front have, so it is a larger shock body with a bigger piston, more oil capacity, and increased travel. So it's definitely made to keep up with the same abuse that you're going to be putting the front end of the truck through, and these will definitely hold their own as you're bombing across the desert or tearing up some trails out in the woods. Overall, these Kings provide a really stout and capable off-road suspension setup for this truck that's still very manageable and daily drivable, which is a big part of what we like about this. It doesn't ruin the truck's capability on the road, and it's still something that you can enjoy taking back and forth to work every day or using to pick up the kids or get groceries, whatever that may be. Now, with that being said, we are doing a separate review on this King suspension, so be sure to check out that video if you want a little bit more in-depth detail on how this rides and how it stacks up against some other competition on the market. But for now, that's all I'll say. It is a really solid kit and it works well here. Moving on, we did also do another suspension mod underneath that came a little bit after we initially installed the Kings, and that was a set of Grimm off-road tubular upper control arms. These new Grimm UCAs are a tubular steel design, and they have a uniball instead of a standard ball joint, so they're quite a bit more durable than the factory ones were, and it made a lot of sense to upgrade these with how hard the truck was going to be getting pushed with the King suspension that we upgraded on here as well. The other benefit of these arms having a uniball versus a standard ball joint is that it actually allows for a bit more articulation installation, because standard ball joints tend to bind up after a certain point, and especially with a truck that's lifted 2.5 inches, or if you're running a lift that's even taller than that, you really don't want them pinned at a terrible angle and it can mess with your alignment, whereas the Uniball allows for a little bit more room for that to flex, and it's not going to catch and bind quite the same way. On top of all of that, these Grimm UCAs also feature polyurethane bushings that connect to the frame mounts, and those do have grease fittings on them so they can be serviced and re-greased over time, which is really nice because it provides a bit more longevity, especially when you have a factory arm that's probably just going to wear out and get tore up, and you can't really replace the bushings on it once it goes bad. So I think that just about covers everything there is to say in terms of suspension upgrades, but obviously all of those changes wouldn't make any sense if we were just leaving stock wheels and tires on the truck, so that was the next area to cover. The tires we optioned in for this build are a set of Toyo Open Country RTs, and these are a 305/70/17, which rounds out to about a 33.9-inch tire, or a 34 if you just want to make it clean and even. And that's a pretty large tire for these F-150s, but with 2.5 inches of lift, it tucks it pretty nicely. Now, the question that's always on everyone's mind when we talk about fitting a larger tire like this is, did you have to cut and trim to make it work, or cut crash bars? And the answer is pretty much always yes, and here the answer is still yes. So I know that upsets a lot of you guys and you hate cutting crash bars, and that's okay. If you don't want to do that to your vehicle, just size down the tire or go for a larger lift to accommodate it. But for the stance we wanted here, and for the stance that the owner wanted, we knew that there was going to be some trimming involved. So we did cut the crash bars, but with them out of the way, this thing has plenty of room to articulate. It holds the tire well, and there's a lot of really good off-road capability that's maintained without the truck being so tall that it kind of has a weird center of gravity to it. Talking in terms of the actual tire design now, these are an RT, which kind of puts them in between, where they're not an all-terrain and they're not a mud terrain. They're sort of a happy medium, which the RT stands for rugged terrain, and it's kind of funny branding from Toyo, and it's a weird segment to exist, but it does actually make for a really nice tire. So the benefit here is that you have larger tread blocks, more siping, and a bit more aggressive sidewall than you'd have on a standard all-terrain, but it's not quite to the extreme of what a lot of the mud terrains are, so you maintain a bit more on-road comfort and capability. Now, these do strike a really nice balance there. They're fairly quiet. They definitely get the job done for any trails that we've needed to tackle, and I think they look really nice on the truck as well. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that even though these are kind of a happy medium, they're not a perfectly silent tire, and if you're used to just a factory highway tire or a less aggressive all-terrain, these are going to be a little more noisy than what you're probably comfortable with. But if you've ran a lot of mud terrains in the past and you're used to loud vehicles, or you've had old Jeeps and things like that, then this probably won't affect you at all. And I do think that it's still a very reasonable tire for somebody that wants to daily drive their truck. It just adds that extra little bit of mechanical traction to really enhance the truck's performance in the dirt. Moving right along to talking about wheels now, what we have here are 1552's Traverse wheel, and we optioned it in a 17 by 8.5 inch with a 0mm offset. And this is a little smaller than some of the wheel sizes that you might have from factory. A lot of times these trucks have an 18 or a 20-inch wheel on them, but we prefer the 17 just because it allows for more sidewall, so there's more room to air down the tire, and the look is a little more appropriate for kind of the desert runner aesthetic that we were trying to keep here. With this also being only an 8.5-inch wheel, the width is a bit smaller than some of the other aftermarket options that are out there, and I personally prefer that just because I think it allows the tire to bulge and look a little bit bigger, and because the sidewalls can kind of roll out over the wheel, it protects that wheel face from some rock damage or curb checking and whatever else. Looking more closely now at the wheel's actual design, these are a satin black wheel, which is a really good color for this truck, and with all the other black accents we have on here, it ties in pretty nicely. And the overall aesthetic of the wheel is very simplified, which I personally prefer a more simplified design. I don't like a lot of ornate details or screw heads and machine pieces all over it. It just gets to be a bit too flashy and too complex. Plus, with a more simple wheel design like this, they're a lot easier to clean if you really off-road and wheel your truck often, and that can be a big benefit. It's also worth noting that in terms of the style and overall stance of the truck, the 0mm offset that we ran here is a bit more aggressive than the factory offset, so it brings the wheel and tire out to the edge of the fender, but it doesn't stuff it way outside the vehicle where there's a lot of exposed rubber and it looks kind of silly or looks like a roller skate. This is a bit more reasonable, and it also protects the truck a little bit because the tires aren't just kicking mud and rocks up the side of the vehicle all the time. So fills out the look, and I think as a whole, this wheel and tire combo is a pretty good match for all the suspension mods that we added before it. Working our way down the list, the next set of upgrades I want to talk about are some of the lighting mods that we've added to this truck, and one of the most obvious ones that changed are these new AlphaRex Nova Series headlights. These are the jet black version of the Nova Series lights, and we really wanted to option these in because the factory halogen lights have such dismal light output, and we didn't really love the yellow color that comes with having a halogen bulb. The AlphaRex units improve on this by using a dual LED projector setup, and these actually have LED chips built in, so we didn't have to add in aftermarket LED bulbs to get the look that we wanted or the output that we wanted. And because of that and the way it's designed, the projectors are really calibrated to work with those chips, so you get a good even cutoff and a lot more range in the amount of light output that you have, but it also takes care of the color temperature issue. So instead of having that dated yellow look from the halogen bulbs, we now get a nice clean white output. On top of all of that, these headlights also feature a new LED DRL strip around the outside, which improves the look pretty significantly. And these run as a white LED when you're actually using them as daytime running lights, but they are multifunctional and they actually operate as a switchback. So what that means is that when you flick your turn signals on, these will actually switch to amber and they'll flash sequentially. And on top of all of that, it'll still do this if you kick your hazards on, and there's kind of a neat startup sequence that AlphaRex builds into these lights. So if you unlock the truck or fire it up remotely, you'll see them flash on, and it just kind of runs through a little 3-stage sequence. And it may not be everybody's cup of tea. I think it definitely has some mall crawler energy to it, but honestly, we really enjoy it, and it's kind of fun to see, especially if the truck's out in the parking lot and you're walking up to it. The last thing I want to mention about these headlights is that they are also a true plug-and-play install. So they have all the connectors and everything that you need to tie into your factory wiring, which means that you don't have to do a bunch of cutting and splicing or adding in whole new wiring harnesses to get these to work. Now, AlphaRex does provide some separate wiring to add different functionality or allow you to dim and change the DRLs, and that's something you can add if you do want to, but we ran them as just strict plug and play on this truck, and it does everything that we need. So I think for a lot of guys who are looking to upgrade their headlights, this is probably going to be an option you want to consider. If you make your way around to the back of this truck, you'll notice that we also swapped out the taillights when we did the headlights, and these are actually Anzo aftermarket taillights, but I won't go into too much detail here because these were pretty quickly discontinued after we installed them. Now, there will be some newer versions available that have some sequential functionality and are a little bit more built out, but these ones we liked just because they were an LED upgrade over the factory halogen taillights, so the output looks better and it matches a little bit more cleanly with what we did up front, and then because they're blacked out on the inside, it ties into all the other black accents. Bringing the focus back to the front of the truck, the next thing I want to talk about are these rigid SAE and DOT approved fog lights that we swapped in place of the factory units. Now, the reason I specifically point out SAE and DOT approved is because these are truly street legal, and that's not always the case for LED upgrades for fog lights. There are a lot of options out there that have kind of uncontrolled beam patterns or too much light output to really be used on the street, and there are plenty of brackets that allow you to run off-road lights in your fog light pockets, but you still can't use them on the road legally. So we wanted a kit that was a little bit more multi-purpose and really offered us the ability to use them every day. Just because these are street legal does not mean that these rigid lights lack in light output. They're still significantly brighter than the factory units, and we also chose to run them in the selective yellow lenses, which creates a yellow light output. And that may not be everybody's favorite, but we actually kind of prefer that with fog lights because the yellow light tends to be a bit less reflective off of fog and dust and snow. There are other options available though. If you're not a big fan of the yellow, you can still run white, and typically the white has the presence of being a bit brighter or seems like it has more light output. Usually that's just because of the color temperature, but it is an option to consider if you're looking for a fog light system like this. These rigid fogs are also quite a bit more durable than the factory units, which is a big benefit for a truck like this that spends a lot of time in the dirt and is prone to getting abused and needing to get through some rougher terrain than your factory fog lights are really equipped to deal with. Lastly, talking in terms of wiring, these rigid fogs can be ran with an entirely new harness if you want to add a separate switch for them, but you can also get little wiring adapters that tie into the factory fog light wiring because this truck already had fogs to start, so that allows us to reuse that same factory switch. We don't have to have a bunch of extra wires that are unnecessary, and it makes it really clean in the cab, which is a big plus. So looking at this truck, you can tell that the rigid fog lights aren't the only rigid lighting upgrades that we've done here, and the next one I want to talk about is that Adapt E-Series light bar that's sitting in the front bumper. I will preface this section though by saying that this E-Series Adapt bar in the lower bumper may not be the exact setup that you want to run for your truck, and it was a little bit more of a custom job to get this to work. Now, what I mean by that is that because this is a dual row E-Series light bar, it's pretty thick and it fills in that whole gap within the lower bumper. So on a truck like ours that's an EcoBoost, it blocks off a bit of the airflow to the intercooler that sits behind it. So typically the way Rigid recommends it and the way they designed the brackets for this system are to be used with a single row light bar that's a lot thinner, so that way the air can kind of travel around it and you don't end up blocking off that airflow. Now, that's not to say that this has completely ruined this truck or that we constantly have overheating issues. It still has ran pretty well for us, and we haven't really ran into any big issues yet with having the light bar down there. But personally, it would have been my preference to run a single row light bar here. So if you are considering a setup like this for your truck, keep that in mind. With that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about why this Rigid light bar is so unique. The thing that really stands out with these Adapt series bars is that they have GPS units built into them, and that GPS unit allows the bar to actually modify the beam pattern depending on the speed that you're going and how you're driving the vehicle. As you can see looking at the front of the bar, there's essentially 3 different zones, and on the outside you have some wide scene lighting that is just a big general fill of light right in front of the vehicle, and this isn't going to have a lot of distance, but it does allow you to see everything around the front of the truck. Then moving inwards, there's a driving pattern section, and this is going to give you a little bit more forward projection in front of the vehicle instead of just a wide scene area light, so it focuses in that beam, and then as you dial it in and go a little bit faster, the last section is a spot beam that's right in the middle, and that's going to allow you to really punch in and see quite a ways ahead of the vehicle once you're getting up to speed. The way it works obviously is as that GPS is reading it, it'll fan through these different zones to create the right kind of spread and the right kind of distance that you need for how you're using the vehicle. So that way when you're coming up and slowing down into a corner, you get a wider spread, you can look into it, and then as you accelerate out of it and continue forward, you get that projection that you need to see any obstacles that are coming towards you. So with this kind of technology, the big question that we hear a lot that we also had for Rigid when this came out was, what happens when it loses GPS signal? Does the light just shut off and you're out of luck? But thankfully the answer is no. The light does actually have a feature where when it drops GPS signal, it'll just turn on all of the LEDs so you get full output all at once. That way you're not left in the dark. And you can also trigger it with the switch to just naturally switch all LEDs on if you don't want it to follow and change the beam pattern as you're driving. So there's a bit more functionality there, and this thing isn't going to leave you stranded, but it can be a really nice upgrade for those of you guys that are looking for something that's more cutting edge in terms of off-road lighting. Next up, I want to move from talking about lighting upgrades into focusing more on accessories, but this next accessory kind of covers both sides of that. So to explain a little bit more in depth, I want to talk about the GoRhino Sport Bar that we have on the bed. This Sport Bar is the 2.0 version, which is a little bit bulkier than the 3.0 version, and we do have a video that explains the differences if you want more information there. But what you need to understand is that this is not a true roll bar. It's called a Sport Bar for a reason, so it's definitely designed for looks, but the other practical purpose that it has is that you can mount lights on top of it to project over the top of the vehicle. Now, with this specific model that we have here, there's an upgrade that is added in that allows it to tilt the light mount bracket so that way you can actually retract the lights down and they're not always sitting up right above the truck. So as you can see, we've got a couple different dualies wired in there, and these are all spot beams, so they're designed to project out over the roof of the vehicle and give us some real distance in front of the truck. And that's one of those things where depending what lights you run and how you set it up, you may get a little bit more glare, or you might have a bit more trouble getting it to project over such a large cab, but in the way that this truck's being used and how we have it set up, they seem to work pretty well. Something I do want to make sure to note here though is that these GoRhino Sport Bars can be a little bit cumbersome to install, and that's maybe understating it slightly. The 2.0 bar here was pretty difficult to line up on the F150's bed, and it does require you to drill into the actual bed caps along the sides. So if you're looking for something that's more bolt-on and very simple to put in place, this may not be the upgrade for you, but if you really like this style and you need a place to mount some lights above your roof, then it's worth considering. So as you're looking at the back of this truck bed, you'll notice that with the Sport Bar, we're actually also running a Retrax retractable tonneau cover underneath it. And there are a couple different tonneaus that will work with these bars if you want to have that combined utility. It's a bit of a trick to get them to fit together, but with the Retrax tonneau, we were able to make it fit pretty nicely, and it does seal off properly, so it'll keep dust and water out of the bed and protect anything that's in it. You do lose quite a bit of bed space with a setup like this, so obviously because the tonneau is retractable, it has to roll into a box that sits at the bulkhead of the bed, and it costs you about a foot of space. But you're also kind of losing some of that space vertically with the Sport Bar sitting over it. So a setup like this isn't going to be ideal if you use your truck bed for hauling every day, but if you only need it for gear and equipment, or you're using the truck to tow and you're not necessarily loading up the bed, then something like this shouldn't cause a lot of issues for you, and it does give you a nice covered area to store extra gear. Shifting away from the bed of the truck and moving around to the side of the vehicle now, another upgrade that we added in were GoRhino's Dominator D6 side steps. And these are not a rock slider and they're not truly frame mounted. It is just a side step, but they're still quite a bit better than what you'd get with your factory side steps that come on these trucks off the lot. Now, the reason I say that is these are a little bit more sturdy. They've got a tubular steel design with a flat steel plate on the top, and it's all got a textured black powder coat with some nice cuts in there to give you good traction even when they're wet or there might be some mud or dirt caked onto them. And these are also a little bit higher up on the vehicle, and they tend to hug the body lines a bit better than the factory steps do. So if you're out wheeling your truck and you get into a trail that needs a little bit higher clearance, these steps tend to not get hung up quite as bad as the factory ones do, since they aren't hanging down as low, and it allows you a little bit more breakover angle. On top of that, if you do happen to catch them or hit them against a rock and damage them a little bit, they're going to resist getting beat up a bit better than just a plastic step will. So while they may not be a rock slider and you're not going to want to set the weight of the vehicle on them, they are going to be a little bit better if you really do wheel your truck. The very last upgrade I want to cover here, I kind of lumped into accessories, but it's more of an engine bolt-on mod, and that's going to be the S&B Cold Air Intake that we installed. Now, I wouldn't really call this a power adder or a big power upgrade, just because cold air intakes typically don't change the engine performance that much, but they are a good way to replace the factory equipment with a new aftermarket filter that's oiled and can be washed and cleaned over time, and it does open up the sound of the motor a little bit more, especially in a turbocharged motor like these 3.5 EcoBoosts. You tend to get a bit more turbo noise, and it has kind of a nice sound to it. And that may not be everybody's favorite thing. I know some folks prefer for their trucks to be quieter, but if you are looking for an intake, something like this will provide you that benefit. Either way, we knew that the factory filter in this truck was getting pretty gummed up and we were going to have to replace it with something, so we decided to throw an S&B kit in there because they do make some of the nicest intakes on the market, and the install is pretty simple for these. It's one of those mods that you can knock out pretty easily in your driveway with some basic hand tools, and it's not going to eat up your whole weekend. So in a truck like this, it was just that final touch to really wrap things up. So folks, that's going to be a wrap on this build overview. Hopefully you enjoyed this and it gave you some ideas for your own F-150 build. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there are separate install videos and some reviews on some of these parts specifically if you really want to deep dive on certain upgrades that you like, but this should be a good starting point for you. It's also worth mentioning that we will have links to all of these parts down in the description, so those will shoot you over to our website and you can take a look if you want to pick any of this up for yourself. And as always, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.